The person who made sugar possible may never have tasted it as comfort. They may have known it as heat, as a blade, as a field, as a command shouted near a boiling house, as a crop that had to be cut, crushed, and cooked before someone far away could call it sweet. That is the hidden distance inside sugar. By the time it reached a European tea table, it looked clean, white, refined, civilized. A small luxury placed beside porcelain cups and polite conversation. But at the beginning of the chain, sugar was not polite. It was land taken for cane. It was forced labor under the sun. It was fire under copper pans. It was the body turned into a machine for someone else's appetite. And that is what makes sugar different from many other ordinary things. Its power was not only that people loved sweetness. Its power was that sweetness made people willing to ignore where it came from. So before sugar became a symbol of comfort, celebration, and childhood, who had to disappear from the story? At first, sugar does not look like history. It looks like a small white cube beside a cup. It looks like a spoonful disappearing into coffee before work. It looks like frosting on a birthday cake, a cold soda in a gas station cooler, a cereal box on a kitchen counter, a packet torn open with one hand while the other hand reaches for a phone. Nothing about it asks to be examined. That is part of its power. A person can begin the day without ever touching a sugar bowl and still meet sugar again and again. It may be in the cereal poured before sunrise. It may be in flavored yogurt, coffee creamer, bottled tea, ketchup, bread, granola bars, salad dressing, or a sauce that tastes more salty than sweet. By the time the day is over, sugar may have entered the body through products that did not announce themselves as dessert. This is not the old image of sugar. The old image is simple. A spoon, a bowl, a choice. You decide how much to add. 1 teaspoon, 2, maybe none. In that image, sugar is personal. It is visible. It waits politely on the table until someone reaches for it. But modern sugar often works differently. It has moved from the table into the recipe, from the recipe into the factory, from the factory into the package, and from the package into habits that feel almost automatic. It does not need to be seen to be consumed. It only needs to be useful. To make a drink feel brighter, a sauce feel fuller, a breakfast feel faster, a snack feel more rewarding, a product feel familiar enough to buy again. That is why sugar is such a dangerous object to underestimate. Not because every grain is evil, not because sweetness itself is new. Human beings have always noticed sweetness. Fruit, honey, sap, and ripe plants were signs of energy, long before there were factories, brands, or nutrition labels. The strange part is what happened later. Somewhere between the first taste of cane and the modern supermarket aisle, sugar changed roles. It stopped being only a rare sweetness and became a system. It became something empires could tax, merchants could ship, planters could force into production, factories could standardize, advertisers could dress up as happiness, and consumers could absorb without thinking. A white crystal became a way to organize land, labor, appetite, and profit. That is the story hidden inside the ordinary. Stand in a supermarket aisle and look carefully. Sugar is not only in the candy section, it is in the breakfast aisle, where boxes promise energy and childhood. It is in the drink aisle, where sweetness becomes refreshment. It is in the condiment aisle, where a tomato sauce or barbecue sauce can carry sweetness under a savory mask. It is in products designed not to look indulgent, but convenient. This is how sugar becomes invisible, not by vanishing, but by spreading. The more places it appears, the less any single appearance feels important. A spoonful in coffee feels harmless. A little in bread feels normal. A bottle of soda feels like a personal choice. A sweetened breakfast feels like routine. Each moment is small enough to dismiss. Together, they reveal something larger. Sugar has become one of the quiet languages of modern food. And yet, this clean, familiar substance did not begin clean. Before it could sit in white packets and bright packages, it had to pass through heat, distance, and power. It had to be planted where the climate allowed it. It had to be cut before it spoiled. It had to be crushed, boiled, clarified, dried, packed, shipped, priced, advertised, and repeated on a scale large enough to make the final product feel cheap. Cheapness is not a natural condition. It is made. Someone has to lower the cost. Someone has to speed up the work. Someone has to carry the risk. Someone has to disappear from the price tag. That is the question sugar keeps asking, even when it looks silent on the shelf. If sweetness feels effortless now, where did the effort go? The answer does not begin in a supermarket. It begins much earlier, with a plant that was not white, not clean, not weightless, and not easy. It begins with cane, tall, fibrous, heavy, and full of juice that had to be forced out by human hands, animal power, metal rollers, fire, and time. Before sugar could become the white thing on the table, it first had to become something else entirely, a crop that demanded a machine. Before sugar was cheap, it was difficult. It did not begin as a white powder waiting in a paper bag. It began as a tall grass with a hard, fibrous body and juice locked inside its stalk. To reach the sweetness, someone had to cut it, crush it, press it, boil it, watch it, and keep working while heat changed the liquid into something that could travel. That was the first transformation. Sugar was not simply found. It was forced out. Many histories trace sugarcane back to the tropical world of New Guinea and Southeast Asia, where the plant was known long before it became a global commodity. But cane by itself was not yet the sugar people would later fight over. A person could chew the stalk. They could taste the juice. They could recognize the sweetness. But juice is not empire. Juice spoils. Juice is heavy. Juice belongs to the place where it is pressed. It does not cross oceans easily. It does not sit neatly in a merchant's ledger. It does not stack in warehouses or wait in a cupboard for months. For sugar to become powerful, sweetness had to be changed into a form that could be stored, counted, taxed, shipped, and sold. That is why crystallization mattered. Imagine a worker standing over a pan of cane juice as it thickens in the heat. At first, it is liquid and unstable. Then it darkens, it foams, it becomes syrup. The air grows humid and sweet. But the work is not gentle. The liquid has to be watched carefully. Too much heat, and it burns. Too little, and it remains too thin. The person near the fire is not tasting luxury. They are managing a difficult change. Then the crystals begin to appear. Small, grainy, valuable. This was one of the quiet revolutions in food history. Once sweetness could become crystals, it could move differently through the world. It could leave the field. It could outlive the harvest. It could be packed, traded, prescribed, gifted, guarded, and priced. It could become something far more abstract than a plant, a commodity. In early worlds where honey was often the more familiar sweetener, refined sugar could seem strange and rare. Some writers described it almost like a kind of honey made without bees. Others treated it as medicine, spice, luxury, or curiosity. It was not yet the background taste of everyday life. It was something unusual enough to be noticed. That distance matters, because when we look at sugar today, we usually see the end of the process, not the problem that had to be solved. We see whiteness, dryness, convenience. We do not see the original difficulty. Cane full of juice, juice full of water. Water that had to be removed by labor, fuel, vessels, skill, and time. The early history of sugar is the history of making sweetness less fragile. A stalk could rot, juice could sour, syrup could stick to the place where it was made, but crystals could travel. And once sugar could travel, it could enter larger systems of trade. From South and Southeast Asia, knowledge of sugarcane cultivation and sugar making moved through merchants, physicians, cooks, monks, soldiers, and imperial routes. It moved toward Persia, the Islamic world, the Mediterranean, and eventually Europe. But at each step, sugar carried a problem with it. It needed the right climate. It needed water. It needed land. It needed cutting and crushing. It needed boiling. It needed people who could be made to do the work again and again. That was the shadow inside the crystal from the beginning. Sugar promised pleasure, but it demanded organization. It was not like picking fruit from a tree and eating it in the shade. It required a sequence: field, knife, press, fire, pan, crystal, package, road, ship, buyer. Each step made sugar more useful to someone farther away from the plant itself. And the farther sugar moved, the more tempting it became to control the places where cane could grow. That temptation changed the story. As long as sugar was rare, it could remain a luxury, expensive, strange, and limited. But once European demand began to rise, rarity became a business problem. People did not only want to taste sugar, merchants wanted more of it. Rulers wanted revenue from it. Investors wanted plantations that could produce it in volume. The question shifted. It was no longer only, how do you make sugar? It became, how do you make sugar cheaper? And that question would become dangerous. Because to make sugar cheaper, someone had to make cane fields larger. Someone had to make work faster. Someone had to make islands productive. Someone had to bring the plant, the mill, the fire, the ship, and the labor together in one controlled machine. Sugar's next great transformation would not happen in a kitchen or a medicine chest. It would happen on an island. The next place sugar learned power was not a continent. It was an island. An island could be cleared, measured, watched from the sea, divided into fields, connected to one harbor, forced to serve one crop. That was what made the Atlantic islands so important. Before the Caribbean became the great theater of sugar, the plantation machine rehearsed on smaller stages. Madeira, the Canaries, São Tomé, places that looked, to European investors, like experiments in climate, labor, shipping, and control. In Madeira, Portuguese colonists found more than land. They found a position in the Atlantic, close enough to Europe to supply its markets, warm enough for cane, and isolated enough to be reorganized around export. Forests were cut, hillsides were turned into fields. Water had to be moved, mills had to be built, cane had to be brought quickly from the field to the press. The island began to change shape around sweetness. By the 15th century, Madeira was no longer just a remote island. It was becoming a sugar island. Picture the harbor at Funchal. A ship waits offshore. Men carry barrels, tools, and timber. Merchants speak in different accents. A mill turns somewhere inland, fed by cane cut from newly cleared ground. The island is not feeding itself first. It is feeding a market somewhere else. That detail matters. A plantation is not just a farm. A farm can grow many things for people nearby. A plantation is different. It is land disciplined for export. It is a landscape narrowed until one crop becomes more important than food, forest, village, or season. It is agriculture redesigned for someone who is absent. Sugar made that absence profitable. In São Tomé, the logic sharpened. The island sat off the west coast of Africa, close to the routes that would soon feed the Atlantic slave trade. There, the sugar system became more brutal and more complete. Monoculture, mills, imported food, enslaved labor, and a crop made for distant consumers. The island was not merely producing sugar, it was producing a model, a terrible model, one that could be moved. The cane field became a blueprint. Clear land, plant cane, build a mill, import labor, export sugar, buy more bodies, expand the fields. Repeat, this is where sugar begins to look less like food and more like a machine. The machine did not need to be made of iron at first. It could be made of land and law, water and fire, ships and ledgers, overseers and debt. It could turn an island into a factory without placing a roof over the whole thing. The cane grew under open sky. But the logic was already industrial. Everything had a schedule. Cane could not wait forever after cutting. Mills needed fuel. Boilers needed heat. Ships needed cargo. Merchants needed predictable supply. Investors needed returns. The whole island had to move with the crop's demands, as if the plant itself had become a clock. But plants do not give orders. People do. And the orders behind sugar were becoming harder. The more Europe wanted sweetness, the more land had to be cleared. The more land was cleared, the more labor was demanded. The more labor was demanded, the more violence entered the system as a tool of production. This was the dangerous turn in sugar's history. The problem was no longer how to make a crystal from cane juice. That had already been solved. The new problem was how to make enough crystals for a growing appetite across the sea. And once that became the question, every limit began to look like an obstacle. Forest, time, distance, human exhaustion, even human freedom. On an island, the violence could be hidden by geography. The consumer saw a cone of sugar or a white fragment on a table. The merchant saw weight, quality, and price. The investor saw yield. The empire saw revenue. But the person in the field saw the island differently. They saw rows of cane where other plants could have grown. They saw paths to the mill. They saw smoke from the boiling house. They saw the harbor, not as an opening to freedom, but as the mouth through which the island's labor was carried away. That was the island machine. It taught Europe that sugar could be scaled if the world around it was rearranged. Not just the crop, the land, the water, the port, the labor, the law, the body. And once that lesson existed, it did not stay on Madeira or São Tomé. It crossed the Atlantic. The Caribbean would take the island machine and enlarge it. Bigger fields, more ships, greater profits, more violence. The small white crystals that had once required careful fire would now require something darker. A whole social order built around cane. Sugar had learned how to travel. Now it would learn how to consume lives. The field did not taste sweet. It cut the skin. It trapped heat. It filled the air with leaves sharp enough to scratch arms and faces. Cane could rise taller than a person, so that the worker inside the rows could feel surrounded by the crop that ruled the day. This was where sugar's clean appearance began to break apart. On a Caribbean plantation, sweetness did not begin with a spoon. It began with a blade. The cane had to be cut close to the ground, bundled, hauled, and moved toward the mill before the juice inside the stalk began to lose value. The plant carried its own deadline. Once it was cut, time became another overseer. A worker in the field was not simply harvesting food. They were feeding a machine that could not pause for exhaustion. The sun climbed. The rows continued. The cane leaves dragged across the body. The knife rose and fell. Behind the field was the mill. Behind the mill was the boiling house. Behind the boiling house was the ship. Behind the ship was a table far away, where sugar would arrive clean enough to seem innocent. That was the brutal genius of the plantation. It separated the place of suffering from the place of pleasure. In the field, the body met the first demand. Cut more, move faster, keep the cane coming. But sugar did not become sugar in the field alone. It had to pass into fire. The boiling house was one of the most important and most punishing spaces in the sugar world. There, crushed cane juice was turned into syrup and crystals under heat. The room could be thick with steam, smoke, and the smell of hot molasses. Large pans or kettles held liquid that had to be watched, skimmed, transferred, and boiled down. If the field belonged to the blade, the boiling house belonged to the furnace. Imagine standing there after the cutting is done. The body has already spent itself under the sun. Now the air is hotter. The floor is sticky. The light comes from fire. The work demands attention because the product can burn, spoil, or fail. Sugar was not patient. It punished mistakes because every mistake threatened profit. This is the part that disappears inside the white crystal. Sugar looked delicate when it reached Europe, but its production was not delicate. It required repetition under force. It required people who could be treated as instruments of time. Hands to cut, shoulders to carry, eyes to watch the pans, backs to bend, lives to spend. The plantation made that treatment legal. Enslaved people were not simply poor workers trapped in a difficult job. They were property in a system built to extract labor by denying personhood. Their families, movement, rest, and bodies were controlled because the crop demanded regularity and the market demanded supply. Violence was not an accident beside the sugar system. It was one of the ways the system protected itself. That is why sugar became one of the clearest examples of how comfort can be built on distance. The consumer did not need to hear the order shouted in the field. The buyer did not need to smell the boiling house. The merchant did not need to see the person whose hands cut the cane. By the time sugar arrived in a barrel, a cone, or a refined piece, it had been translated into weight and price. The human being had been translated out, but the cost remained. Some museum histories describe the labor on colonial sugar and rice plantations in terms that are almost hard to absorb. Not decades of life, but years of survival. Sugar did not merely use labor. In many places, it consumed people faster than they could be replaced by birth. So the system reached outward for more forced bodies. This is where the Atlantic becomes part of the story. Ships did not only carry sugar away from the plantation, they carried people toward it. They carried iron, cloth, weapons, rum, ledgers, insurance papers, and the legal language that helped turn human life into property. The sweetness on one side of the ocean was tied to captivity on the other, and the field understood this before the table did. A person cutting cane did not need an economist to explain global demand. They felt it in the length of the day. They heard it in the command to keep moving. They saw it in the cane carts coming back again, and in the smoke that kept rising from the boiling house. The market was not an abstract force. It arrived as a schedule for the body. Sugar made time violent. Harvest compressed everything. Cane had to be cut. Juice had to be crushed. Fire had to be kept hot. Ships had to be filled. The plantation did not measure life by seasons of rest. It measured life by output. That is why the field and the fire belong together. The field took the plant from the earth. The mill broke it open. The boiling house stripped away water. The barrel made it transportable. The ship made it profitable. Each step made sugar cleaner for the buyer and more dangerous for the people closest to its making. By the time it reached a tea table, sugar could look like civilization. White, ordered, refined, quiet. But the refinement was never only chemical. It was moral, too. The process did not just remove color from sugar. It removed the sight of the people behind it. It made suffering easier to swallow by making the product beautiful. That beauty was not accidental. It was the final disguise. A white crystal could cross an ocean without carrying the sound of the field. It could sit beside porcelain without showing the heat of the boiling house. It could sweeten a drink without naming the person whose life had been shortened to make it possible. And for a long time, that was enough. Sugar did not need people to forget everything. It only needed them to see the sweetness first. But eventually, some people began to look at the sugar bowl and see the field again. That would become sugar's next transformation. Not from cane into crystal, but from luxury into accusation. For a long time, sugar had done its best work quietly. It sat on tables without explaining itself. It entered tea, cakes, preserves, medicines, and polite hospitality as if it had no past. The white crystals had traveled across oceans, but they arrived stripped of the field. No cane leaves, no heat, no ship hold, no name of the person who cut the stalk. Then, in Britain, some people began to look again. The sugar bowl became a strange object. It was still domestic, still small enough to sit between cups, still close to the hand that lifted a spoon. But now it could carry a question that reached across the Atlantic. Who made this? In the late 18th century, abolitionists urged British consumers to refuse sugar produced by enslaved labor in the West Indies. This was a different kind of attack on slavery. It did not begin with a battlefield or a law court. It began at breakfast tables, tea tables, kitchens, and shops. It asked ordinary people to treat a household habit as a political choice. That was a dangerous idea, because sugar had become powerful partly by making distance feel normal. The plantation was far away. The boiling house was far away. The slave ship was far away. The person stirring tea did not need to see any of it. A spoon could move from bowl to cup without crossing a moral border. The boycott tried to put the border back. Imagine a woman standing in a Georgian room, the table set with porcelain, tea, bread, and a bowl of sugar. The room looks orderly. The cups are clean. Then she notices the inscription on the bowl. East India sugar, not made by slaves. Suddenly, the object on the table is no longer silent. It is making an accusation. To choose one sugar over another was to admit that sugar had a history. It meant the sweetness in the cup was not just a matter of taste, but a matter of labor. It meant a household could not pretend the Atlantic system ended at the port. It had entered the room. This did not make the problem simple. East India sugar was promoted as an alternative to West Indian sugar, and that alternative could become its own kind of marketing. A cleaner label did not erase empire. It did not make all labor free in any modern sense. It did not undo the wealth already drawn from enslaved people in the Caribbean. The sugar bowl could reveal a moral problem, but it could not solve the world sitting on the table. Still, the reveal mattered. For once, sugar's distance collapsed. The white crystals no longer looked weightless. They became evidence of a system. A person could refuse them, argue over them, pay more for an alternative, or dismiss the campaign as sentimental. But after the question had been asked, the old innocence was harder to recover. That is why the sugar boycott belongs in this story. It was not only a protest against slavery, it was a protest against invisibility. It challenged the comforting idea that consumers were separate from the violence that made their comforts cheap. It suggested that buying was not always private. Sometimes, buying was participation. If a woman at a tea table could turn sugar into a political object, then the empire had a weakness inside the home. If a shop could advertise sugar not made by slaves, then the market itself could become a place where conscience competed with price. If families could refuse West Indian sugar, then the plantation system was no longer hidden behind distance alone. The table had become a map. On one side of the map was the refined world that sugar helped decorate: tea, manners, hospitality, cakes, preserves, the rituals of polite society. On the other side were the fields and fires that made those rituals possible. The bowl sat in the middle. That was sugar's fifth transformation. It had been a plant. It had become a crystal. It had become an island machine. It had become a product of forced labor. Now it became a moral test. But the test had limits. The British slave trade was abolished before slavery itself ended in the British West Indies. Even after ships were legally barred from carrying newly enslaved people into British colonies, the people already enslaved on plantations remained trapped for decades. Sugar could be boycotted, debated, and labeled, but the system did not vanish because households put down their spoons. That is the hard lesson of the sugar bowl. Seeing the cost is not the same as ending it, but not seeing the cost is how the system survives. By the 19th century, sugar would keep changing. New sources, new refineries, and eventually food industries would make sweetness more available than ever. The moral accusation would not disappear. It would be buried under a different promise: progress, industry, convenience. Sugar had been exposed once as a product with blood behind it. Its next trick would be even more subtle. It would learn how to look modern. The next disguise was not silence. It was progress. After the sugar bowl had been accused, sugar did not leave the modern world. It entered it more deeply. It moved through refineries, beet fields, factories, bags, tins, bottles, breakfast boxes, and advertisements until the old plantation product began to wear a new face: cleaner, scientific, industrial, modern. For centuries, cane had tied sugar to tropical land. That mattered because tropical land could be seized, planted, and forced into export. But in Europe, another possibility slowly became more important: sugar from beets. The beet did not look like empire. It looked like a root, heavy, pale, pulled from colder soil. It did not carry the same image as cane bending under a Caribbean sun, and that image mattered. During the upheavals of the Napoleonic era, when war and blockade disrupted access to cane sugar, beet sugar became more than a curiosity. It became a political solution. If sugar could be grown from a European root, then sweetness did not have to depend entirely on colonial cane. Factories could be built closer to home. Fields could be measured in new ways. Chemists, engineers, and governments could treat sugar as an industrial problem. This did not make sugar innocent. It changed the costume. The factory became the new theater of sweetness. Instead of a cane field leading to a boiling house, there were beet fields leading to processing plants, diffusion tanks, evaporators, centrifuges, and sacks of standardized crystals. The old violence of the plantation did not simply disappear from history, but sugar's public image began to shift. It could now be described through science, efficiency, national production, and price. That is one reason sugar survived accusations so well. It learned to become technical. A refinery does not look like a slave ship. A package does not look like a cane knife. A food label does not look like a plantation ledger. Industrial modernity gave sugar a new language, and that language was useful because it turned moral history into manufacturing. The question was no longer only, was this made by slaves? The question became, how cheaply can this be produced, refined, packaged, and added to something else? That last step changed everything. Sugar's greatest modern transformation was not simply that people could buy more of it. It was that food companies could build products around it. Sugar could do many jobs at once. It could sweeten, thicken, preserve, brown, balance acidity, improve texture, and make a product taste more familiar. It could make bitterness softer and blandness less obvious. It could help turn processed food into something repeatable. Imagine a factory floor. A mixture moves through stainless steel equipment. Flour, flavoring, oil, salt, cocoa, fruit concentrate, corn syrup, or refined sugar enters a formula. The person eating the final product will never see the ingredient as a spoonful. They will see a cookie, a soda, a breakfast cereal, a flavored yogurt, a sauce, a packaged snack. Sugar has not disappeared. It has been assigned a role. This was different from the sugar bowl. At the table, sugar waited for permission. In the factory, sugar arrived before the consumer did. That gave companies a new kind of power. They did not have to ask a person, how much sweetness do you want? They could decide the sweetness in advance. They could test it, adjust it, brand it, and wrap it in memory. Childhood, energy, reward, celebration, comfort, convenience. The old empire had controlled islands. The new industry controlled formulas. And formulas were harder to see. A shopper can recognize a spoonful of sugar. It is harder to recognize sweetness when it is spread through a product's texture, color, shelf life, and emotional promise. It is harder still when the package does not say, "This is sugar's history." It says, "Whole grain, original, family size, classic, refreshing, low fat, energy, fun." By the 20th century, sugar was no longer just an ingredient. It was part of branding. Candy did not simply sell calories. It sold childhood. Soda did not simply sell liquid. It sold refreshment and social life. Breakfast cereal did not simply sell grain. It sold speed, cartoons, and the promise that a busy morning could still feel cheerful. The product became a story, and sugar helped make the story easy to believe. This is how sweetness learned to hide in plain sight. Not by becoming rare again, but by becoming useful to too many industries at once. It could serve the chemist, the factory owner, the advertiser, the retailer, and the tired person looking for something quick. The plantation had made sugar cheap enough to spread. Industry made it flexible enough to become background. By the time the modern consumer reached for a packaged food, sugar was often no longer a visible decision. It was already inside the design. That was the new form of distance. Not only distance from the field, but distance from the moment of choice. And that distance would shape the final part of the story. Because the modern problem with sugar is not only that people like sweetness, it is that the world became very good at delivering sweetness before people realized they had chosen it. By the time sugar reaches the modern world, it rarely looks like a plantation product. It looks like choice. A person stands in a supermarket aisle, holding a bottle of sauce in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other. Neither looks like candy. Neither feels like dessert. The package speaks in calm words. Classic, wholesome, original, family size. The colors are clean. The label is small. The sweetness is not the first thing the eye sees. Then the person turns the package around. There it is. Added sugar. Sometimes it appears directly. Sometimes it arrives under another name. Sometimes it is part of a syrup, a concentrate, a sweetener, or a formula designed to make the product taste fuller, softer, brighter, or more familiar. The shopper is not forced to buy it, but the choice was prepared before the shopper arrived. That is the modern sweet trap. Sugar no longer needs a plantation owner standing in view. It no longer needs a sugar bowl engraved with a moral warning. It does not even need to announce itself as pleasure. It can enter through convenience, through a breakfast that must be fast, through a drink that promises refreshment, through a snack between meetings, through a sauce that makes cheap food feel complete. The old question was whether sugar was made by enslaved labor. The modern question is different, but not separate. Who benefits when sweetness becomes the background setting of everyday life? Public health agencies now treat sugar not as a harmless decoration, but as a measurable part of diet. The concern is not the sweetness of an apple or the memory of a birthday cake. It is the steady presence of free and added sugars in products people may consume without thinking of them as sugar at all. This is why the nutrition label became a new kind of sugar bowl. It does not carry an abolitionist slogan. It speaks in grams, percentages, serving sizes, and ingredient lists. It asks the modern consumer to do something strangely similar to what abolitionists once asked. Look past the surface of the product and ask what is inside. But looking is harder now. A sugar bowl was simple. You could see the crystals. You could refuse the spoon. A modern package may contain dozens of ingredients. It may sell itself as low-fat, natural, fortified, high-energy, or made for children. It may sit in an aisle where every box has learned how to sound harmless. A parent picking cereal before school is not thinking about Atlantic slavery, beet factories, or food chemistry. They are thinking about time. A worker buying a soda is not thinking about commodity history. They are tired. A teenager choosing a snack is not reading the story of empire. They respond to color, flavor, habit, and price. That is the point. The modern system does not need people to love sugar consciously. It only needs sweetness to feel normal enough that no one stops the day to question it. This does not mean every sweet food carries the same moral weight. It does not mean a person drinking soda is guilty of history. The deeper story is not about blaming the consumer. It is about understanding how the consumer became the final stop in a system built before they were born. Sugar has always been good at borrowing innocence from the place where it appears. On the tea table, it borrowed innocence from porcelain, manners, and hospitality. In the factory age, it borrowed innocence from science, efficiency, and progress. In the supermarket, it borrows innocence from branding, convenience, childhood, and choice. Each age gives sugar a cleaner costume, but the old pattern remains. The people farthest from power carry the most pressure. In the plantation age, that pressure fell on enslaved bodies in fields and boiling houses. In the industrial age, it fell through labor systems, farm economies, factory work, and global commodity prices. In the modern food environment, it also falls on consumers asked to manage the health consequences of a world designed to sell them sweetness cheaply and constantly. Sugar did not stop organizing life when slavery ended. It changed where the organization happened. Now it happens in product design, shelf placement, advertising, subsidies, corporate supply chains, school lunches, gas stations, vending machines, and the architecture of habit. The cane field is no longer the only place where sugar shapes behavior. The aisle does it too. The lunchbox does it. The drive-through cup does it. That is why sugar's modern history is not a clean break from its past. It is an echo. The old system made the producer disappear. The new system often makes the design disappear. People are left facing the product as if it were merely personal preference, when enormous structures have worked to make that preference feel natural. So when sugar appears today, the question is no longer only, where did it come from? It is also, who arranged the world so that it would be everywhere? And why, after all this history, does it still look so small? Tomorrow, sugar may still look small. It may sit in a packet beside coffee, in a cereal box on a kitchen counter, in a bottle pulled from a gas station cooler, or in a label so ordinary that the eye almost skips over it. It will not announce the cane. It will not show the first worker standing over boiling juice, waiting for sweetness to harden into crystals. It will not show the island cleared for export, the harbor waiting for ships, the mill turning inland, or the field where cane rose taller than the people forced to cut it. It will not show the fire. That is what refinement does. It removes what the buyer does not want to see. It turns a plant into a crystal, a field into a price, a body into labor, and a history into something white enough to disappear. But sugar's story was never only about taste. It was about the human hunger for sweetness, and the systems built to satisfy that hunger at a distance. It was about empires learning that pleasure could be organized. It was about islands turned into machines, labor turned into property, and comfort made possible by people whose names were not written on the package. Then, for a moment, the sugar bowl became evidence. A small object on a tea table forced people to ask whether a household comfort could carry a crime from across the ocean. Some put down the spoon, some looked away. But once sugar had been seen as a moral object, it could never be only sweetness again. The modern world did not erase that question. It changed its shape. Now sugar moves through factories, formulas, brands, labels, aisles, school lunches, vending machines, and habits that feel personal because they happen one choice at a time. It no longer needs to be rare to be powerful. It only needs to be everywhere, useful, cheap, and easy to miss. So the next time sugar dissolves, that may be the image to remember. Not just the sweetness entering the cup, but everything that had to vanish for the cup to feel innocent. A sugar cube is small enough to disappear in water. The world built to make it cheap was never small at all.